starting with the Old English period, which I went through more or less of the history the other day. So today, according to the syllabus, we should be on the Wanderer, but because we're one day behind, we're not on the Wanderer, we're on Bede. But I'm going to try and get Bede and primarily the Caedmon story done fairly quickly and jump into the Wanderer. Even if you haven't read the Wanderer, it won't take you long to read it. But the ecclesiastical history, okay? I believe I said the other day, this is sometimes regarded as the first real history. I mean, Herodotus wrote a history of the Peloponnesian Wars in the 5th century, 4th century, BC. Yeah, that's history, but it's not history in the sense that Bede does it, because Bede actually gets confirmation of events. He not only uses eyewitness accounts, he gets secondary accounts. He sends to the Vatican for correspondence with the popes, okay, to get, word for word, so to speak, quotations that he can use. Right? So he writes this, and the exact title of it is The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Notice, ecclesiastical. It's the church history. That's what his main concern is. The history of the church of the English people. Now, it doesn't begin with the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes. He goes into the founding of Britain. Okay? And Bede, like others after him, they don't necessarily follow Bede on this, because there are some earlier writers who deal with this a little bit too, slightly earlier, not much. Bede includes this notion, and it's kind of an English myth, that Britain, okay, or the Britons, B-R-I-T-O-N-S, descend from Brutus, B-R-U-T-U-S. Not the Brutus of Julius Caesar fame, but another Brutus, who is a descendant of Aeneas, A-E-N-E-A-S, okay, of Virgil's famed poem, the Aeneid, okay, who is one of the sons of Priam, king of Troy. In other words, the Britons are really Trojans, okay, who fled Troy after the destruction of Troy by the Greeks. Okay? That's part of this British national myth, so to speak. Okay? From what we historically, archaeologically know, no truth whatsoever to this. Okay? The Celts probably came into the Isle of Britain sometime in the first millennium BC. That is, after about 1000 BC. We don't know who the people were who built, for example, Stonehenge. They're not Celts. They're pre-Celtic. Okay? And the Celts, by the way, just completely off topic, take my history of the English language course whenever I offer it again, which I have no idea that will be. And we go into a lot of this. The Celts as a group did not rule like the Romans ruled. They didn't have a single centralized ruler, like an emperor. They had a lot of little chieftains. And because of that, they never get the credit that Rome got. Because the Celts, as a group, ruled over almost as vast an area as the Roman Empire did in about 700 BC. Okay? Salzburg, Vienna, the name, it's Celtic. Comes from the Celts. Okay? Northern Germany was ruled by the Celts all the way over to parts of Greece. When St. Paul wrote a letter to the people in Galatia, the word, the Gal part of Galatia, that's related to Gaul. The old word for what is modern day France, well, those were the Gauls. The Gaul and Gal is Kel. They're all Celts, in other words. Okay? So, Bede kind of begins with that prehistory, but then he jumps to the founding, as we talked about a little bit the other day, which was included in the material you read. But we want to get up to Caedmon, because Caedmon's the really important part. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Christianization, but not much. I want to pick up with, in talking about Bede, page 48 in your text. Okay? And this is when Bede is writing about Paulinus. Okay? And this is after Augustine of Canterbury. Okay? And Paulinus is talking to Edwin, one of the kings. Okay? There are numerous Anglo-Saxon Judish kings. Edwin is one of them. All right? And Paulinus is talking to him. And earlier, Edwin had a dream. And the dream was, if a guy comes up to you and he puts his hand on your head and says something to you, do what he says. Okay? So, Paulinus is talking to him, page 48. And you get to the bottom of the right-hand column. And the king listens to Paulinus, and he's ready to accept, what Paulinus says, hook, line, and sinker. But the king says, before I do, I've got to follow protocol, so to speak. And he says, I'm willing to be bound to accept the faith which Paulinus taught, or said that he was willing to be bound, but that he would confer about it with his own chief men and counselors, so that if they agreed with him, they might altogether be cleansed in Christ, the fountain of life. Paulinus agrees, good idea. And so the king did as he said. That is, he goes to his counselors and the chief priests of their religion and tells them what he's thinking. And we're told, Coifi, the chief of his own priests, that is, the head of all the priests of the pagan Germanic religion at the time, answers the king. And he says, consider, O king, this new doctrine that is being preached to us. For I say to you truly that as far as I can tell, the religion we have practiced until now has no virtue in it. Now, by virtue, he doesn't mean positive attributes. Like we think of virtues or positive traits. He means what the word virtue literally means, power. He says, our religion is what? Powerless. Okay? He's speaking as the chief proponent of that religion. None of your people has devoted himself more diligently to the worship of our gods than I. And yet there are many who receive greater favors and greater honor from you than I do, and are more prosperous in all their undertakings. So remember how he began? As far as I can tell, our religion is, okay, he says powerless. What does he really mean? If it's powerless, what other less is it? Worthless. Why? Because he says, nobody has practiced it as faithfully as I have. And yet, you shower gifts and favors more upon other people than upon me. Now, he's really doing two things here. One, he's saying, our religion's not worth anything. And two, you don't pay me as much respect as I deserve. Okay? But he's kind of couching the second under the first. If the gods had any power, they would have helped me more readily. If our gods, and he's saying, were real, then they would have listened to and seen my prayers to in support of them, and I would have been favored. But because I'm not favored, therefore, logically stands, they must not be real, since I have been more careful to serve them. It follows, therefore, that if on examination those new doctrines which are now preached to us are found to be better and more effective, we should accept them. That is, if this new faith, put it another way, if it works, that is, if you believe in it and you receive something from it, let's follow it. He's kind of saying, let's put it to the test. Let's try it out. So one of his underlings, another one of the king's supporters, says, king, seems to me life's kind of like this. And he tells a story. It's not a big, long story. It's not a broad story. It's not a story with a narrative arc necessarily. It's a snapshot, like a Polaroid of life. And he says, seems to me life's like this. This is the present life of man. This is how the present life of man, O king, seems to me in comparison with that time which is unknown to us. Well, what's that time which is unknown to us? Before and after. Right? What happened? Where were, quote unquote, you before you were born? Didn't exist. How do you know? Well, you don't know. You know that this you came into existence at the time of your birth. What happens more importantly, he suggests, after, when you die? I mean, people are still wrestling with that question. Hamlet wrestles with it. Harry Potter wrestles with it. Okay? I do that in my Harry Potter course. So, he says, here's what it's like. It's as if you're sitting in your feasting hall with your aldermen, that is your lords and princes and such, and thanes in wintertime. His thanes, his sworn soldiers, those who will defend him, those who will fight for him. Now, in Anglo-Saxon society, I need to mention this, you have the lord or king, and beneath him, he has his thanes. Dukes, earls, all that kind of stuff is later. Okay? But they exist in a reciprocal, kind of a symbiotic relationship. Right? The things go off and fight for the Lord and King. The Lord and King often leads them into battle. Right? But then the Lord and King does something for them. If they're victorious in battle, the Lord and King pays them. Pays them from the spoils of war. Distributes treasure. Okay? So that relationship is always going on. It's always like this. They fight for, he distributes treasure. So a king or lord who doesn't distribute treasure is not a king or lord worth fighting for. Right? It's going to be an important distinction when we get to something like Beowulf. Because you will see things turn on their lord and king if the lord and king isn't keeping his end of the bargain. It's a deal, in other words. It's not like the later feudal relationship where you have king, duke, baron, earl, all the way down the line, and then beneath that he has his, or they have their warriors who fight for their lord, king, duke, earl, etc. Why? Merely because they've sworn allegiance. There is nothing necessarily, that is ipso facto, there is nothing necessarily reciprocal in that later medieval feudal relationship. Okay? You just swear fealty to your Lord. Why? Because God has put that Lord above you. They don't have that in this period. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Okay? You stop scratching mine, and I'll put a sword through your belly, kind of a thing. Okay? So, he says, here's what life's like. It's wintertime. This room is now the hall. All right? In the center of the hall, right about here, there would be a hearth. Think of it as a fireplace without the chimney. Because there'd just be an open hole at the top of the roof. So you have a big fire, flames would rise, smoke would rise. Most of the smoke would go through the chimney or through the hole in the roof, but some of it would spread out. So the hall would kind of be a little dark and smoky. Like some bars you can go into, or used to be able to go into. Unfortunately, you can't go into a pub in England anymore and have any smoke. And I'm not a smoker, pipe and cigar smoker. But you can't go anywhere and have a cigar, inside. So, right around the fire, it's bright. But the farther away from the fire you get what? You recede into shadows. Okay? So, imagine, Lord, you're sitting there around the fire, he says, with your thanes, your aldermen, you're feasting. Why? It's cold outside. Winter is blowing. The snow and hail are beating against the walls of the building, because it's walled, it's wooden building, it's not stone walled, okay? And he says, with a good fire burning in the middle of the hall, all inside is warm, while outside the winter storms of rain and snow are raging. And a sparrow flies swiftly through the hall. Why? Because the hall looks like this. Okay? These are planks, upright planks. I'll post pictures to D12. And it's got a window here and a window here. What do I mean by window? An opening. That's it. There's no glass. The word window comes from, trying to remember how it's actually begun in Old Norse. I think it's this. Comes from Old Norse vindauga. Auga are these eyes. This is wind. It's the eyes of the wind. That is the opening to the wind. That's what a window is. That's why you open your windows during springtime. Let the air blow through the house and get all the crud that's been accumulating for the months of winter out. So he said a sparrow does what? Right. It's stormy out here. Inside here, you've got the nice fire raging. It's warm. There's singing going on, or people reciting great old poems that are now lost because of Henry VIII, the bastard. So the bird flies through. Out here it experiences what? The winter. The winter, the wind, the cold, the rain, the harshness. It comes in here. It's nice. It's warm. But it keeps flying, and it goes out here. He says human life is like what? It's this part. More or less. Sometimes it's like this part, but out here. Sometimes it's like this part, but, some damn fool down here pulls out a bow and arrow and goes, pierces that sparrow and has squab for dinner. In other words, it's not all light in life. Okay? But he's saying, this is the part we know. We don't know where we began. We don't know where we go to. While he is within, the winter storms cannot touch him. But after the briefest moment of calm, he immediately vanishes out of your sight. Notice what he's saying about life. It's brief. Thomas Hobbes, 17th century, said, human life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Just think about that for a moment. And if you're familiar with Waterston's, I think that's his last name, Calvin and Hobbes, the comic strip. Okay, Calvin is the John Calvin I was talking about the other day. Presbyterianism, tulip, depravity, that Calvin, okay? And Hobbes, life is poor, nasty, brutish. He's punning on these two perspectives of life, okay? So Hobbes said human life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and then you die. Not a very positive outlook on things, okay? But it's kind of what this guy is saying. While he is within, the winter storms cannot touch him. But after the briefest moment of calm, he immediately vanishes out of your sight, out of the winter, and back into it again. So this life of man appears just for a moment. I mean, this pagan Germanic priest, could be channeling David, the author of the Psalms, who says essentially the same thing. One day, your life is here like the grass growing, and the next, the sun withereth it away. Of what went before or what is to follow, we know nothing at all. Why? Because the Germanic pagan religion didn't say anything about before human existence, or what happens after. Now, it does a little bit what happens after, but not ultimately. Anybody know what happens, quote unquote, after? How many of you have seen Thor Ragnarok? Because that doesn't tell you anything. It's completely wrong. Okay? What is Ragnarok?
Isn't it whenever, is the wolf's name?
Fenris Ulf.
Yes, and he finally
Little
breaks.
shout out to C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia there, by the way.
And he finally comes free of the chain.
He's released from his chains, yes. Okay. Ragnarok, Richard Wagner translates that to the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods. It's the end of the world. Okay. Germanic mythology essentially ends in some versions. Some versions. There are a few that have a little bit more positive spin. I'll give you the negative spin first and then the slightly more positive one. The negative spin is like this. Loki, the frost giants, the dwarves, the bad guys all win. Lights out, game over. In other words, evil prospers. Evil thrives. Chaos wins. Order, reason, goodness, truth, beauty, justice, apple pie, mom, American way, loses. Thor, Odin, and all their supporters die. It's it. Not very positive, right? Okay. That's the kind of majority version. Now, a minority version says, and all this begins, by the way, because of a series of events set into motion by, I almost said the actor's name, Loki. Okay? That series of events is the gods are all having a party one day up there in Asgard, doing what they do. And there are two brothers among the gods. I shouldn't be going into this. Balder and Hother. Boldr and Ho, what's called an F, think of it as a D, R. Balder and Hother, they're brothers, okay? Balder can't die. Not he can. But he can only die one way. There's only one way you can kill him. Kind of like Achilles, right? The reason we have the Achilles heel is because Thetis dips Achilles in the sticks. And she holds him by that tendon. Everything else goes under. Everything but that. Hit him in the heel, he dies. Balder is a little bit different. Balder can only be killed with a sprig or point, like an arrow point, of mistletoe. So you got to essentially make an arrow, make a point or something, a mistletoe, and stab him with it. Mistletoe doesn't make good arrow points. Okay? So they're up there partying in Asgard, and everybody's, having fun with Balder because they're shooting stuff at him. This is, what the gods take for fun. You can't kill him, so hey, let's give him all we got. Right? So Loki comes in and he blindfolds Hother and puts into his hand essentially something like a spear that is tipped with mistletoe. And because all the other gods are kind of blindfolded, it's kind of, blind man's bluff sort of thing. And he points him in the direction of Balder. He kills Balder. Okay? That sets into motion. Loki then flees. Loki frees Fenris Ulf, the great wolf, who has been chained. Okay? Who was chained because another one of the gods, Tyr, from which we get today's name, Tyr's Day. It's Tuesday. Okay? Tyr reached his hand, placing trust in Fenris Ulf, and Fenris Ulf bit his hand off. But when he bit the hand off, they got a chain around his snout. And they enchained him. All right? Loki unchains Fenris Ulf. Fenris Ulf then gets the Midgard serpent, Jormungand, who is this giant snake curled at the bottom of the ocean, encircling the world, to come up out, okay? All hell, literally, in Germanic fashion. All hell, single L, breaks loose, the goddess. That part of Ragnarok is true, okay? Breaks loose, okay? And you get this cataclysmic fight between the forces of good, Thor, Odin, all of those kinds of gods, and all the dead warriors who have been living in Valhalla, who have been taken there by the Valkyries, Brunhild and her sisters, all right? Who, when they die, they go to Valhalla and they sit there and they party. They just party forever. All waiting for Ragnarok, because then they rearm and they fight all the bad forces. The dwarves, the frost giants, Ermengarde, Fenris Ulf, Loki. They lose. Okay? That's the one version. In the minority version, Balder is reborn. See an echo somewhere with another major myth? Okay? Some mythologists actually argue that the whole Germanic, this one version of the whole Germanic mythic system is based upon Christianity. We have no indications of anything of this mythic system prior to Christianity. And you even have, Odin, who hangs on a tree for 9 days. For what purpose? To acquire wisdom. What does he do? He sacrifices his eye. There's various Christ parallels. Okay? So even in the Balder reborn version and the earth being remade, that's the minority version. That's not the one that most people believe in. The one that most people believe in is you're going to have Ragnarok, Valhalla's going to be emptied, and even all the good old pagan Germanic warriors, Beowulf and Hrothgar and Siegfried, etc., they all die again. And chaos wins. Okay? So that's the mentality I think that the priests are talking about. So he says, if this new doctrine contains anything more certain, it seems right that we should follow it. And they all go, okay? Because what does this new doctrine teach? What does Christianity teach as opposed to what Germanic pagan? There's an afterlife. Well, yeah, but there's Valhalla. That's an afterlife. But that comes to an end. In the Christian system, it continues. It's eternal, outside time. Okay? And you're going to see when we get to the Wanderer, how is that afterlife described? It's Valhalla Christianized. Okay? It's Valhalla baptized. Valhalla literally means, the Val means slaughter. It's Old English wow, wow. Place of slaughter, hall. It's the hall of slaughter. It's where all the slain, those who die in battle, go to, okay? So we're going to see in the Wanderer, heaven is essentially Valhalla. It's not only for those, however, who die in battle, it's for all, but it's what? It's the place of revelry. Why? Because whoever writes the Wanderer is probably thinking of the Germanic system, okay? And they're thinking of the end of the book of Revelation, which is all about the wedding feast of the Lamb. You want to go to a good feast? Go to a wedding. If they don't have just a typical crappy little, reception after. If they have a real meal, it's going to be a good eating there, okay? So, Coify says, okay, now I need to hear more about this, what he's preaching. So, Paulina speaks. Coify listens to it. And he says, I've long realized that our religion is worthless. The more diligently I sought the truth in our worship, the less I found it. But now I freely confess that such truth shines forth clearly in this preaching, which can bestow on us the gift of life, salvation, and eternal happiness. In other words, what's he really doing? He's saying, we've got two stories. We have two competing narratives. Does he have facts, so to speak? Not necessarily. So he says what about these two competing stories? This one, the Germanic one, ends in what? Chaos, despair, nothingness. Well, that's not very positive. And by the way, the Germanic language, I think there's one with maybe one exception. The Germanic language of all the Indo-European languages is the only one, again, I think with one exception, it might be Hittite, is the only one that does not have a true future tense. How do we express the future in English? Because English is Germanic. Okay. We use what's called a modal auxiliary. We have to throw in another verb, right? I will go to the store. Because I go to the store means I do it now. Okay? Not in Latin. It's got a separate ending. Not in Greek, not in any of the Indic languages, not in any, if I remember correctly, of the Slavic languages. I'm pretty sure it's Hittite, which is one of the oldest of the Indo-European languages. Doesn't have also a future tense, which might be a link between the Germanic branches and the Hittite branches. Okay? So, what does he say? I like this story better. This one is what? This one has what? Happy ending. Eternal life. Hope. Okay? Some have suggested that Germanic does not have a future tense. Why? There's no real future. There's nothing really to look forward to. And that the ideology influenced the development of the actual grammar of the language. Okay? Don't know if that's true or not. Nobody knows whether it's true or not. We don't know why Germanic doesn't have that future tense. So, he says, I think we ought to just burn everything we've been doing. Burn the temples and altars. Okay? Now, when Gregory sent Augustine, he didn't tell him to go in and, go up there and when you find those damn pagan Germans, damn them, first of all, burn everything. No, he didn't say that. He said, in fact, just the opposite. He said, take their holy places and baptize them. Christianize them. So if they have a holy well that is devoted to spirits, take a cross, make the sign of the cross in the water 3 times, sprinkle it with holy oil and holy water, and make that a place devoted to a saint. Same thing if they have hills that are of pagan significance. Baptize them. Make those holy places to a particular saint. Okay? He didn't go through and say, just eradicate. He said, come on in. We can adopt you and we'll slowly transform you to our way of thinking. Okay? So, Edwin accepts Christianity. And eventually, the rest of Britain accepts Christianity. Okay. Jump to the section about Abbas Hild. Abbas Hild, page 51, section 4. If it's not apparent, I love this stuff, man. It's just great stuff. So notice, in the year of our Lord, 680, in other words, A.D., Anno Domini, he invents, Hild, the most devout servant of Christ, abbess of the monastery that is called Whitby, departed on the 17th of November after having performed blah, blah, blah. So, Abbas Hild dies November 17th in the year 680. Okay? It's an entire chapter. Here it's just section 4. It's like chapter 24 of, I don't remember what book 3 or 4 in the ecclesiastical history. It's long, okay? is devoted all to Abbess Hild. Okay, Abbess, not Abbot, a woman. Some people have said, even scholars of Anglo-Saxon history say, oh, there are no major important women of Anglo-Saxon. This entire chapter is devoted to her and what she did at this monastery. Okay? So we find out she's of noble birth, daughter of the nephew to the king, which I don't know what that makes her. Cousin somehow removed or something. My brother would be able to tell me, but I don't pay any attention to that. And he talks about how she sets up this monastery and such, and the vision she has before her death and all that kind of stuff. So, before she dies, however, page 53, I want to skip to. Before she dies, we're told, in Hild's monastery was a certain brother specially marked by the grace of God, who used to make pious and religious verses, so that whatever he learned from the Holy Scriptures through interpreters, he soon afterwards turned into poetry of great sweetness and humility in English, which was his native language. Notice, whatever he learned of Scripture through interpreters. Why through interpreters?
Because he didn't speak Latin.
Possible. Okay, possible. What's another reason?
Maybe he didn't know how to read or...
That's it. He's illiterate. He can't read. Okay? He's a coward. But he's also a quote-unquote monk. Kind of. He's more coward than monk. Okay? At the monastery. Okay? He turns stories from the Bible into English poetry. Bede writes, by his verses, the minds of many were often inspired to despise the world, to long for heavenly life, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So he kind of backs up and says he'd lived in the secular life until he was well advanced in years. He was old. We don't know how old. And it's not the idea, the popular idea is that, oh, everybody died in their 40s in the Middle Ages. No, they didn't. We got all kinds of accounts of people living into their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Okay? We don't know how old Caedmon was, unless it's told later in the section and I'm completely forgetting it. But let's say he's in his 40s. Okay? So he's been tending cows all his life at the monastery. And he'd never learned any verses. That is, he'd never learned any poems. What does that mean? That means this stuff, which I'm going to explain in a moment. So Bede tells us what they used to do at the monastery refectory, the place where they would eat. All right? They would eat, and then when it was agreed, for the sake of entertainment, all present should take a turn singing. When he saw the harp coming towards him, he'd get up and leave. So Bede tells us this. It was customary in the monastery, after they'd eaten, hey, let's have a song. And so a harp would start being passed around. The idea was you take the harp, you strum a few strings, and you chant a song. This is what's meant by chanting a song. It's not like you get the harp and you belt out, some Bob Dylan. It's not that kind of singing. It's not, E. Cummings' verse, which has no rhyme or reason. Okay? This is very technical verse. So, Caedmon, who can't do this, we're told, what? He sees the harp coming, harp starts here, and Caedmon's sitting here, harp starts to get to her, and he says, see ya. And he gets up and he leaves. He goes out to the cowshed, lays down, falls asleep. And a person appears to him in his sleep, calls him by name. Caedmon, sing me something. Caedmon, I can't sing, that's why I left the feast. In other words, I go back to sleep. Thinks he's woken up. But the individual says, nevertheless, you must sing to me. Caedmon's like, okay, well, what do you want me to sing? Sing about the beginning of created things. In other words, sing about creation. At that, Caedmon immediately began to sing verses which he had never heard before in praise of God, whose general sense is this, okay? Meaning, Bede translates Caedmon into Latin, because Bede's writing in Latin, all right? So he says, the general meaning is this. Why? Because I'm not giving you the original. And because you're not getting the original, you have to only get the general. You can't understand it specifically unless you know it in its original. So, here's his translation. We ought now to praise the maker of the heavenly kingdom, the power of the creator, and his counsel, the deeds of the Father of glory, and how he, since he is the eternal God, was the author of all marvels, and first, as almighty guardian of the human race, created heaven as a roof for the sons of men. He says, that's kind of the gist of it, but it's not the actual order of the words he sang in his sleep. For poetry, no matter how well composed, cannot be literally translated from one language into another without losing much of its beauty and dignity. He's really saying two things there. Well, most importantly, every act of translation is an act of interpretation. Okay? So, we're going to, as we go through some of these Old English texts, I'm going to point out a lot of, like I've been doing here, a lot of very specific words and question how our translator, who is a fantastic translator. I'm not knocking Roy Lisa. He's one of the top Anglo-Saxonists in the world today. I mean, like top 10. Nobody, maybe 10 other people know more than he does, but I doubt it. Okay? But I'm still going to nitpick with some of his translations. Okay? So, Caedmon wakes up. He remembers what happened. Next morning, he goes to the steward, tells him what happened. The steward takes him to the abbess, to Hill. And she says, okay, tell me what happened. He repeats the story. And she, being a good Christian and familiar with the scriptures, abbess, she would, she's got one of John's epistles in her mind that says, test the spirits. Know whether they are from God. And she goes, okay, we're going to test you, buddy. You go off with this priest. He's going to tell you a couple of biblical stories. Tomorrow morning you come back having turned those into poetry. I mean, you talk about final exam. Okay? So, he goes off. He hears a couple stories. He comes back the next morning. He composes them into verse. That is, he can now do all of this. And according to Bede, he then spends a lot of time with priests who tell him all these biblical stories, and he writes poems about Exodus, about Daniel in the lion's den, about Genesis, about Christ on the cross, about the resurrection, about the incarnation, just a whole slew of poems. Well, it turns out we have a manuscript, okay, that in the 19th century was called the Caedmon manuscript because it has a whole bunch of poems that seem to follow the catalog that Bede describes. It was called the Caedmon manuscript because people thought these are Caedmon's poems. Nobody today thinks these are poems Caedmon composed. Nobody does. Okay? Because of a variety of reasons. The date of the manuscript itself, the form of the Old English language in the poems in the manuscript is much, much later than Caedmon, for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them we actually know, if I remember correctly, who one of the authors is. Okay? And then he dies and he writes there's another poem about his death. Okay, but we're going to leave that. Let's look at, in the 35 minutes or so that we have, the actual hymn itself. Okay, you've got it on page 55 in your book, but this is it also. This is Caedmon's hymn. I'm going to read it for you in Old English so you can listen to the sound of it. Okay, let me move over here where I can see it better. Nu schulen herjan heavenrijkjes werd, met tot his machta aan his modjevank. Werk wilder vader, zwa hij wonder was, eetje drichten ora stelde. Hij eerst schot jelde bernum, javen te hrova heilig schippend, Tha midnjard mankenneswaard. Eetje drichten afterteode. Vurum voldan. Freya almichty. Okay? New, now. See, something happens between Old English and Modern English. And it actually happens beginning about maybe 100 years before Shakespeare and finishes maybe about 100 years after Shakespeare. It's called the Great Vowel Shift, where all the long vowels of Old and Middle English shift and become different vowels. Okay? Here's what I mean by that. I'm going to write a phonetic transcription and explain it. Sorry. Not worth using. That's one, and then here's another one. Okay, this is Middle English. This is what I'm saying. Modern English, my feet ache, so do ours. Okay? Middle English and Old English. Mi feet ak sa do oors. This should be kind of an open, what's it called? Mi feet ak sa do oors. My, so the E becomes I. The A becomes E. The sounds, not the letters, okay? The A becomes, lost my place, A. The O becomes O. The O becomes oo, and the oo becomes ow. Okay? It's the difference between, you'll still see, for example, and here sometimes in Scottish English, hum, home. Okay? So, new, what happens to the oo? Becomes ow. New, now. So, for example, if you saw Bossy or Bessie out in the field chewing the cud, that wouldn't be called a cow in Middle English, and it's not called a cow in the Highlands of Scotland today. It's still called coo. Okay? So, who knew broom coo? So, new shulen herion. Now, this is the word from which we get shall. And then this word completely drops out of English. Okay? Most Anglo-Saxon words are not in the modern English vocabulary anymore. They get replaced by the damn French because of the Norman conquest. So, now shall we praise. That's pretty clear, right? Heaven reaches. What do you think reaches is? Kingdom. Heaven, kingdom. Where do we see that? Reich. The third Reich. The third kingdom. What was it? The third incarnation of the Roman Empire. Okay. You also see it in somewhat archaic words like bishopric. Okay. Or, how many of you have read Harry Potter? Come on, show your hands. Be honest. Okay. Most of you. Harry comes from a little town in the west of England called Godric's Hollow. Godric's Hollow. God's Kingdom Hollow. The hollow of God's kingdom. There's an old American evangelical song that says he's got the whole world in his hands. That's what it's like an East Tennessee holler. Okay? So, heavenly kingdoms wired. We still have this word in modern English, but it looks a little bit different. Ward, protector, guardian. Okay? Metodismaka, this is a word completely drops off. And it presents all kinds of problems for translation. It means measurer, but it often merely gets translated God. The measurer's might and his mood-yathunk. Mode, modern English mood, develops out of this, but it doesn't mean he's all, moody. It's mind. Thought. Thunk, okay, is part of that. You see that if you're a Tolkien fan in The Lord of the Rings, because there's a tower named Orthanc, okay? Werk, Wuldor, it's another word, completely drops out. Glory, but fatter, that's pretty close, okay? Fatter, fadir, there's a variety of cognates to that. You even get Dutch. Let's jump down here. Vader. You know what Anakin's nom de plume or nom de guerre really means?
Dark Father.
No, it's not dark. What does Darth mean? Lack father. Well, if you're familiar with the Star Wars mythology, he doesn't have a father. Okay? How he of each wonders, Echa Drichten, both of these completely die out. The eternal Lord, the beginning, or it completely drops out. Astelda completely drops out. Established. He, pretty clear. Arist, we still kind of have that. The beginning, means before the beginning. He first shape. He first shaped. Shope is the same word that's used, however, for poet. Because what does a poet do? Shapes words. Takes words and shapes them into something else. We're going to see a line in Beowulf that's just beautiful. Because the poet is talking about how a poet takes words and binds them together to create a poem. That's what this is talking about. Okay? El de Bernam, for the children, we Scottish bands, okay, children of men, heaven to hrova, heaven as a roof, okay, the holy, heilig, if you know German, Heilige Geist, the Holy Ghost, the holy Shippend. This is the genitive ending, this is the present participle ending. Shaping. The holy shaping. The holy shaper. Okay? Then midden yard. Middle earth. Or the middle yard, if you want. Between the 3 yards. Mankinis. Mankind's protector. Okay? Now, why do I have all of this up here? Because this is why ultimately Caedmon is important. Okay? Whether he actually lived or not. See, prior to Caedmon, nobody had really taken a common, ordinary, everyday, what's called Vulgate language, the language of the people, and used it for quote-unquote Christian purposes. See, I'm not including, for example, their ancient common, what's called Koine Greek. Why? Because, Christianity was born in Koine Greek, so to speak, and Aramaic. But not many people speak Aramaic anymore, and very few speak Old New Testament Koine Greek, etc. Okay? So Caedmon is the first person, kind of historically, to take a native form of the language and a native poetic structure of the language and adopt it to Christian purposes. Right? This is a quote-unquote Christian poem. Does it mention Jesus? Nope. Does it mention Mary? Nope. Any of the saints? Nope. It just mentions God. And does it even have the word God? No, it doesn't. It has Lord, or what gets translated Lord. It has measurer. It has shaper. Oh, it has, I forgot over here, Freya. which is the name of a Germanic pagan god. Okay. The eternal Lord later made for the sons of men, earth for men, the Lord Almighty. Okay, that's what that part means. So here's what he does. So Caedmon sees that harp coming, and he thinks, not, I can't carry a tune. He thinks, I don't know how to do this. Because, I mean, look at this. So these are the rules. Are there exceptions? Yes. Are they many? No. The way these rules were devised is by 18th, 19th, and early 20th century scholars reading Germanic poetry and saying, these are what you see in the vast majority. That is, it follows this. It's not that somebody in 800 AD, Wolf, sat down to write Wolf's, you have the Hodges or the Harbrace Handbook of Literature. He's not doing that. Okay? We do have something like that for Old Norse from the 14th century, where a guy talks all about the requirements, etc. But we don't have that for Old English or earlier Germanic. So these are the rules that are determined on the basis of an analysis of surviving Old Germanic literature. This isn't just Old English. This applies to Gothic. This applies to Old German, Old High German, Middle High German, Saxon literatures, right? They all follow the same model. So, all lines are divided into two half lines. In your book, that's presented, excuse me for just a second, that's presented how? By you get a break between the half lines. Modern English, what's that break called? A caesura. Okay? It's a pause, kind of. All right? So, all lines are divided into two half lines, A and B. Right? Each line, each whole line, has 4 stressed syllables. But when you just look at them, you can't necessarily tell what those stressed syllables are. Okay? We'll get to that in a moment. Each half line has 2 stressed syllables. So it's not the case where you can have 3 stressed syllables in half line A and only 1 in B. There have to be 2 in each side, all right? This is where it gets really confusing. The third stressed syllable, in other words, the first stressed syllable of the second half line, is what determines the alliteration. What do I mean by alliteration? Consonants alliterating with themselves, right? That kind of thing. But vowels also alliterate in Germanic. In fact, each vowel alliterates with every other vowel. So O alliterates with E. A alliterates with I, etc. All right? So now you can then take a poem like Caedmon's Hymn and look at it and say, okay. Because, I mean, you can look at it and see alliteration, right? But the sounds that alliterate are only the ones that are stressed. So there might be other syllables that begin with the same sound, but we don't say they alliterate because they're not actually stressed. So, for example, look at this line right here. Just look at it without talking about stress for a moment. What sounds alliterate there? M, M, M. Okay? You've got 3 there. I thought there have to be 4 in talking about stressed syllables. There do. There have to be 2 on this side, 2 on this side. Well, there's 1, there's 2, there's 1. The other one has to come after. Okay? So where's the 4th one? It's right here. 4th, there it is, 4th stressed syllable never alliterates. We don't know why. But it seems to be a pretty hard and fast rule. Okay? So, wick, bull. Does that mean none of these have any stress in it? Is it all just wool? Because when we don't stress part of a word that comes at the end, what tends to happen to that? How many of you in grade school got in trouble because you dropped your G's? Question, or you're saying you did? Okay. You shouldn't drop your G. It's there for a reason. If the letter's there, pronounce it, by God, so that people will say, well then, how do you pronounce this word? Folk. How do you pronounce this word? Bumb. If you pronounce that bumb, then you're a dumb. Because the b at the end, it's silent. My kids can't believe this. They rag on me all the time. The L there is silent. Folk rhymes with yolk, as in egg yolk. It's not egg yolk. Talk, as I am doing, rhymes with the nearly flat, shiny thing you put on a stove to cook stir fry. And it is spelled W-O-K. Talk rhymes with walk. Okay? It's not talk. Okay? Historically. Now, probably late 20th, early 21st century speech patterns, because it's spelled there, it is getting pronounced there. Why? Because from the beginning of the 20th century on, we tend to pronounce every letter, except for words like, I don't have any up here. Or even this one, unless you're Monty Python. Because this becomes what in Monty Python? A Knigget. Why? Old English, Knicht. The French comes in as a result of the Norman conquest, and the French don't like that sound because they don't have it. Okay? What they hear is "rrr." But that doesn't look like a "rrr." It looks more like a "rrr." That's why the spelling changes. Okay? And that's why today that doesn't make any damn sense. To where if you're learning English, English spelling is utterly chaotic. Why? Because of the introduction of French. Anglo-Saxon spelling makes perfectly good sense. Yeah, Christian.
Because I actually, with the word baloney, I always say bologna just to mess with people. Because when the way it's spelled, I always think, I'm like, that sounds like bologna, not baloney.
Yeah. Okay. I don't remember where I got off on all that. Oh, I'm still over here. Yeah, so we're doing this. Okay. So these work will dur. No stress there. I was talking about, what happens to syllables at the ends of words. We tend to drop them off. Perfect example. What's that called? Silent E, right? Because you don't pronounce it, unless you live in the barrios, homie. Okay? It's a silent E. Why do we still include it? I mean, if it's silent, get the hell rid of it.
It changes the sound of the O.
Well, does it change the sound of the O?
We say it, but
Apparently.
How many of you were taught that in school? All of you. Okay? That's part of quote-unquote phonics. That a silent E makes the vowel before it what? Long. Lie. That is a lie from the pit of hell. Okay? That every grade school teacher teaches the children. It has nothing to do with the vowel that comes. It has everything to do with about 800 years ago and what came after. See? What came after was some kind of inflection. So use this one as a better example. House. Okay? This originally looked like this. Who's that? Okay? And you could go back even further than that. Who's or who's that? Okay? And you start adding these on, to change the inflection. Why? You're changing the case. You're changing it from the subject of a verb to the object of a verb. Whether the direct object or indirect object, it would have a different inflectional ending. Much like Latin, or modern German, or French, or just about any other inflected language. English is one of the least inflected languages today. How many inflections do we have? To indicate what? Plurality. 2. What's the second one? To indicate possession. That's it. So how do we indicate what the case of a noun is? That is, what its part of speech, how it's working in a sentence. Word order. Syntax is everything today. In Anglo-Saxon, in this, we could rearrange these words within these lines. It would mean the exact same thing. Why? Because it's these endings, okay, that tell us everything. This is a plural ending. It means, even though we don't have this pronoun in there, we, it means now we should praise. You have to, when I teach Old English at the graduate level, that's one of the initial difficulties students have. Well, how do I know when I need to supply that subject? I say, do you have a subject otherwise? Now, pray, has it become a declamation, an imperative? No. So you have to say, oh, I get it. Now, we should, and then you go on, okay? So all of this, you see the H, what? Where's, okay, every vowel alliterates with another vowel, okay? What determines the alliteration? The first stressed syllable of the second half line, okay? So we have 2 here that begin with vowels. How do we know which one? Well, it's this one. Why? Because this is merely a prefix. Prefixes don't usually alliterate. They're not that important, okay? H, 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 and then this is the next one. So you have, stress, no stress, what's called secondary stress. Secondary stress doesn't count in this stuff. So Caedmon's been having a few beers as the ale bucket comes down the table, and he sees the harp coming, he's like, hell no. I can't do this. I mean, it's mine. Siri does this every now and then. She tries to interpret me and just has the darndest time.
I'm here.
Shut up. Okay, so this is the problem he has. It's pretty complex, right? He learns it in his sleep. That's attributed to a miracle. But the next morning, he gets told stories, and he does the same thing all over again. And he does it perfectly. So they go, way to go, Caedmon, you mastered Germanic verse form, And he doesn't speak Germanic. He speaks English, which is a form of Germanic, yes, okay? But he does this perfectly. So everything that we're going to read from the Old English period follows all of this. Now, your translations don't. Why not? Okay, because they're translations, that's one. What else? Why else? I've already kind of laid blame on it once or twice before. Because of the influence of French. Okay? French words begin, shortly after the Norman conquest, begin to replace native English words. Okay? Sometimes they live side by side for a while. Okay? For example, you get words that essentially mean the same thing. But they're slightly different. Pork, pig, cow, beef. Pork, French. Beef, French. Cow, English, pig, English. What's the difference between them? A cow's the thing that lives and breathes out in the field. Beef is what you slab on a plate. Pork is the thing you slab on a plate. The pig is the thing out in the muck. Okay? Same with deer, venison. Okay? Often, what happens as a result of the Norman Conquest is you get the introduction of words that replace the thing with an aspect of the thing. How it's cooked, for example. Okay? Color, terms, all that kind of stuff. All right? And one other thing that happens, because of the influence of French, native Old English ability or facility for creating words seems to kind of die out. In other words, it was real easy to create a word if you needed a word in Old English. You just made it up. You take maybe two parts of a word and stick them together. You need a word to describe swordplay that isn't swordplay because you want to be poetic or you want to imply something. No, you say instead, you might say hild leoch, or I'm going to use modern English, battle light. The light that comes off of two swords striking, the sparks that fly. Okay. You want a word to describe the color of the sky when the sun rises in the morning. Day red. Pretty clear. Okay. That kind of starts to die out in the Middle English period, and then we see it kind of reborn in 19th century on up to today, especially with the rise of technology. Because this thing in front of my computer is called what? Keyboard. Are those literally keys? What would be, if we're going to be literal, what would be a better name for it? Button board? Because they're kind of like buttons, but they're not like buttons. Letterboard? Yeah, but those are harder because you go from 2 syllables to more, okay? Yeah, so that kind of change is going on. Okay, few minutes. Turn for a moment. We're not going to get much into The Wanderer. But The Wanderer is a poem in what's called the Exeter Book. Okay? The Exeter Book is one of the major, or 4 major, collections of Old English poetry. You have the Exeter manuscript, the Junius manuscript, the Vercelli manuscript, and the Beowulf manuscript. The Beowulf manuscript doesn't only have Beowulf, it's got other things as well. Okay? But the Exeter book is one of the great collections. It's just got a whole bunch of different kind of stuff. It's got gnomic verses, it's got riddles, and some of the riddles are included in here. It's got elegies. It's just got a whole wealth of stuff. And it's called the Exeter Book because it lives, or is housed, at the cathedral in Exeter, England. And it's been there, we know, since about, your introduction mentions, 1072? Okay, so it's been there over 1,000 years. And it dates from right around 1000 AD. Okay? All 4 of these date from roughly 975 to 1025 AD. Each of these manuscripts. Okay? Old English poetry, if we talked about Caedmon, begins when? Right around the year 680. Okay, so they're roughly 300 years later. All right? So in that manuscript, there are 2 what are called elegies that we're going to read, The Wanderer and The Seafarer. Well, what's meant by the term elegy? What today is considered an elegy? Or if somebody says, oh, that song is elegiac. Okay, they probably don't.
Something that's recited or repeated like something at like a church?
Okay,
A funeral.
Could be something recited at a funeral. Why? Because what happens at a funeral? What are you doing? You're lamenting the loss of something. So an elegy is often a lament over something lost. Okay? It could be a person that is lost. It could be, a loved one that's lost. It could be a way of life that is lost. It could be a time of life that is lost. Old people often elegize their youth because they ain't coming back. All right? You hear some poets elegize, or pun on, in Shakespeare's day, virginity as an example. Because once lost, it ain't coming back, So these two poems are called elegies. So if they are elegies, what are they lamenting? Now, it's pretty clear what the wanderer is lamenting. The wanderer is wandering. He has no home. He's lamenting the loss of home and everything that entails. Okay? So it begins, I know we've only got 3 minutes left. It begins this way. Always the one alone longs for mercy. The Maker's mildness, though troubled in mind, across the ocean ways he has long been forced to stir with his hands the frost-cold sea and walk in exile's path. Hold on just 1 second. Because I want to read for you, assuming my phone will open it. What do you mean no matches? Helps if I spell right. The exact opening lines. I might have to do this on Thursday because that's going to take too long. What I want to get at is the point that your translator, okay, now this is not, I don't think this is in an earlier version. It might be. The footnote number 2, longs for mercy. The Old English word Yebedon, translated longs for mercy, can also mean awaits or experiences. Or mercy can also mean prosperity in an earthly sense. Okay? So, it's not actually, take it back. So, Yebedon. Your book translates longs for. Can also be await. Can also be experiences. Can also be expects. Are is not only mercy or mercies, it can also be prosperity, it can also be favor, it can also be grace. Okay? So look at that sentence again. Always the one alone longs for mercy. Take that last 3-word phrase. Always the one alone awaits mercy, experiences mercy, expects mercy. There's a huge difference between those four differences. Okay? Similarly, if it's not mercy, longs for prosperity, favor, grace, awaits prosperity, favor, grace, experiences favor, prosperity, grace. I mean, if this is your life, and you're using Yebedon and not are, but you're putting, instead of are, a raise, which of these 4 do you want? I don't know about you. I'm looking for this one. Experiences a raise. Why? Because I've been longing for, waiting for, and expecting one for a hell of a long time. And they don't come very often. Okay? Now that's a light way of raising a pretty important issue for this poem, which we'll talk about when we come back on Thursday.